to end this chapter, we're actually going to discuss the macro failure that actually caused by our aggregate demand curve. And first of all, let's discuss what will cause our macro failure. So we actually already mentioned it in chapter 8. Here we will emphasize it again. So there is just two possible problems of the market system. So the one is the market macro equilibrium might not give us a full employment or price stability. So what does that mean? That means we cannot achieve the full employment, or we have a relatively higher unemployment rate. And also our price is too volatile. So that's called the price stability. And even if the market's macro equilibrium were perfectly positioned, it might not last. So that's called unstability. So that are the two main problems. And so the undesired equilibrium, the macros, we will discuss the undesired equilibrium first. And so so the fact there is both full employment and price stability, but there is no reason to expect that the market participants making the independent decision will generate exactly the same the aggregate demand. So if that's the case, and what we will see is we have different kind of GDP gap that is far away from our full employment rate GDP. So if you forget about the full employment GDP, I can help you refresh your memory. So the full employment GDP is the value of the total output produced at a full employment. And so when we have the recessionary GDP gap, and what we'll find is the amount by which equilibrium GDP falls short of full employment GDP, which means the GDP is less than the GDP that associated with the full employment. If that's the case, we call that as a recessionary GDP gap. So if the spending plans of the consumers, investors, government, and export buyers don't generate enough aggregate demand at the current prices, then there will be a recessionary gap, a breeding ground for the cyclical unemployment. So do you remember the cyclical unemployment we learned in 3 chapters ago? So that is unemployment attributable to a lack of job, vacancies, that is to an inadequate level of the aggregate demand. So we talk so many different kind of employment, seasonal, structural, but cyclical unemployment is the one we consider as very unhealthy. And even if we have the possible policy, we will deal with the cyclical unemployment. And so if we will have the cyclical unemployment, usually we will have this kind of recessionary GDP gap. And so the opposite scenario is called inflationary GDP gap. So inflationary GDP gap, as I said, is the opposite scenario. So when it will happen, when the market participants demand more output at the current prices that the economy can produce, then there will be an inflationary GDP gap, a breeding ground for demand pull inflation. So when we have inflationary GDP gap, we are expecting we will have inflation in the society. So for the let me define inflationary GDP gap. That is amount by which equilibrium GDP exceed full employment GDP. So which means current GDP will be larger than the GDP that are associated with the full employment. And as I mentioned about the demand pull inflation, what does that mean? That means an increase in the price level initiated by excessive aggregate demand. So after we look at the definition for recessionary and inflationary GDP gap, and we will look at them from a chart, which will help us to analyze the situation we were facing. So first, I'm showing you the 3 very general pictures and 3 different ones. So the first, number A, is considered very healthy, call it macro successful. So look at the equilibrium GDP. The intersection between AD and AS is E1. So under this E1, you can see it is the vertical horizontal axis value is QF, so which means the equilibrium GDP is equal to the full employment GDP. So if that's the case, we said that the market actually successfully functionally. So they are meet their macro, we'll consider as macro success. So this we aim. So our B and C are considered as a failure. So the first one is considered as what we just call we have a recessionary gap. So we have a recessionary gap, and usually it is related to the cyclical unemployment. So first look at the intersection between AS and AD, we got E2. So under E2, the horizontal axis value is QE2, which is here. And where is our macro goal? So our macro goal is 14-point GDP, which is corresponding to QF here. So the QE and QF, there is a gap. So since QE is smaller than QF, this gap we will call the recessionary GDP gap. And for the this picture C, what we see is considered as inflationary gap example. So again, starting from the intersection between ES and D, we find this E3. So the horizontal value for E3 is QE3 here. And where's our goal? So our goal is QF here. So we can see there is a gap between QF and QE, and since QE2 is larger than the QF, so we will consider this as inflationary GDP gap. Usually when we see the inflationary GDP gap, we will have demand pulled inflation. So now we're going to look at the last two pictures in detail, and we will look at one by one. So first of all, we will look at the recessionary gap. So on this chart, we see the AD and AS, and we also see the recessionary GDP gap. So initially, well, our goal is QF. So if under the QF, our production, our supply will be at this point, and corresponding to this point, the market price will be P star. So the P star means too much would be produced because it's such a higher price and it's much higher than the equilibrium price at the P2. So there are unsold inventories. So we cut back production and lay off workers. So then the equilibrium point will occur at the P2, right? So if we just pursuing our full employment rate, we will end up such a high price and nobody gonna be able to afford it. We end up lay off and reduce production. So our equilibrium will occur at the P2. So at P2 we found that the equilibrium production is QE. QE is smaller than QF. So that's why we created this gap between QE and QF called recessionary GDP gap. So here I want to mention there is a problem what we are facing now. So what we see is US has a very high employment rate. So our unemployment rate is the lowest in the past 20 years. So it sounds very interesting because people are happy about economy, seem like economy is reviving. But the problem here is if we have on another side, our international trade got hurt. What does that mean? That means for the factory, they used to be able to produce 100 airplanes. Since they are tariff and the foreign partners stop purchasing as many as they can because they cannot afford it. So now they reduce to 8. So this kind of change take a little bit of time because usually when you do international trade, you have all kind of contract, so it may last for 1 or 2 years. And then this will have impact. The tariff will have impact on long term. So used to producing 10 flights, now you only can producing 8 aircraft. So what does that mean? That means the market doesn't need as many as before, and for the business, they want to make money. So the number one thing is to save cost. So then they will lay off workers, cut back production. So what we'll see is the QF maybe move back to QE, and then we will back to the recession and creating the cyclical unemployment, and eventually our unemployment rate will goes up, and also will create this kind of recessionary GDP gap. So that's why many economists are so against the tariff, because that's kind of great impact on our AS curve, and also neither to see our AD curve. And so next we will look at analyzing our inflationary GDP gap. So if we look at the inflationary GDP gap, so at the price P star, so if we look at the P star, so what happened is there's not enough would be produced, because you can see under the P star, this is how much they will produce, which is QF, and try to produce QF amount. And so since our demand is this curve, so we need that much, we only produce that much. So the difference would be Q3 and QF. So people want more. So what happened is with the inventories depleted, we began to sustain capacity and the price will rise. Supply and demand, keep in mind. So the price rise. So when the price will stop rising, when they reach to P3, will stopped, and then correspond to P3. AD and AS, they are intersect with each other, so this will be our equilibrium point. At this point, we produce QE amount of the output, and so the QE is larger than QF. The differences between here will be our inflationary GDP gap. So you can see why we said the inflationary GDP gap is demand pull up, because you can see if we are just trying to keep the full employment rate GDP we're producing here, and then we still have that much consumer cannot get it, and they definitely can't afford it. So for a business, you will not leave your business if you see that's a business. And so what they can do is, okay, we have so many demand, we actually have more power, so we can raise our price a little bit. And once they reach to this point, so everybody will stop moving. So the business will stop increasing the price, and the consumer will not start asking about the product. So we reach to equilibrium. So this is perfect. However, we have the inflationary GDP gap. So you can see our price level increase from P star to P3. That's a great increase. So this is the inflationary GDP gap. So this is the end of this chapter, and hopefully you will enjoy the lecture, and good luck in your homework.